Everyone. We are here for the session on golden configs. Uh, this is a session on how do you, it's more of a both how do you work with golden configs and also a session on how do you use some of the Akamai tools that we have for this session. Before we get into the session, I'm just going to introduce myself and then talk about what are we going to do, talk about what are we going to talk to in this session. So a little bit about me. I'm a product manager at Akamai. I actually live at a 15-minute walk from our Cambridge headquarters. So you'll see I've moved around quite a bit. But I live in Boston right now. If any of you are Real Madrid or Duke basketball fans, come talk to me. Oh, nice. We already have one. We can have a big conversation about that. And really, my whole career, I've really focused on what I call the complex tech space. So this is essentially working with really complicated technologies, trying to simplify them, figuring out how that translates to a better user experience, better user benefits. And that really is what this session is about. One of the key trends that we see as our users get more DevOps savvy, as our users go towards microservices, is the whole concept of a gold config. What I'm trying to do in this session is talk to where are our users going. Why is the need for gold configs before even talking to it? And then get a little bit more hands-on. It's always, I hate it when people just present slides and don't get more hands-on. So I'm going to hope to just show you some of the tools that we have in our toolkit today. We are going to talk to a lot of different tools on how do you implement golden configurations, and then we are going to do a quick recap. So where do we see our users going today? The big thing that our users, the big direction, pretty much every company we are working with, pretty much everyone who's on the Akamai platform today is going towards is microservices. So back in the day, you had this monolithic platform. In our case, it translates to a configuration. You basically, just in terms of how you're going directionally, you then had more of a loosely coupled approach. But eventually, the end goal for everyone, whether you're already there, whether you're at Nirvana or whether you're still getting there, is to have these really decoupled services, microservices, wherein different dev teams can work in a distributed manner in parallel, and then just release faster. So again, just to recap that, when we look at our Akamai user base, that's brought a big change in how our users are looking at Akamai. So you see different distributed teams looking to control their own logic, whether it's configuration logic, whether it's logic related to something else. You have really rapid release cycles. Now, because these teams can go independently, you can release faster. And just in general, we've kind of seen that Akamai has gone away, or our primary user has gone away from being a generalist to more of from being an Akamai specialist to more of a generalist. So the big piece of feedback we kept getting from users is that back in the day, Akamai was the only thing I worked on, and now I'm working on Akamai and AWS and my load balancer and a bunch of other things, and it's really hard because we can't spend a disproportionate amount of our time on Akamai. So that really is microservices, the change that we've seen. And I want to kind of, again, hit on what we saw traditionally back in the day when it came to Akamai and when it came to this. So back in the day, a lot of our users would work in Luna. So if any of you, and how many of you in the audiences have even today work with Luna? Pretty much everyone. So back in the day, if you work with Luna, if you work with Property Manager, this is an interface you see that is very familiar with you. And the whole concept of microservices, as our users tended to gravitate towards microservices, the big challenge is now every time I spin up a new service, whether it's for a new region or whether it's for a new app, whether it's for a new environment, it's really hard because now I'm spinning up a whole new property. That can be manual. Firstly, I've got to spin up a property. I've got to make all of my property configuration again. It's a steep learning curve because I am not the person who's spinning up these properties. It can be dev teams who've never worked with Akamai before. It can be other users in my organization. And really, a lot of these times, I don't want them to define everything in the configuration. Some of that needs to be abstracted. Some of that is defined by me. I want them to kind of work on something a little bit more abstracted. And so really, all of this led to this process being really maintenance heavy. So the big piece of feedback we got from users when it came to this was not we are going towards that continuous integration cycle. It was more around we are in a state of continuous coordination. You're always working with different teams around, hey, are you done with your config change? Can I activate? Are you done with your config change? You're always coordinating with his different teams. And that's a big challenge. Now, here's the flip part to that. The other piece to that is as our users started doing this, and as our users started going towards that microservices heavy model, this is kind of what the architecture looked like. You have all these configurations in different pieces. The big challenge when you think about microservices is consistency. And so maintaining consistency between all of these different users was really, really hard. And so, again, I see a couple of nodding heads. Anyone else associate that with how you see that across your teams? I see a lot of nodding heads in the organization. And so, again, the big feedback that our users get is now our teams, our apps look like they are built by 20 different teams. Now we are going a lot faster, but now we are going like headless chicken. And so that's really the problem we are trying to solve when it comes to gold configs. Really apologies for the way too colorful slide over here, but the whole point of gold configurations is really simple. It isn't a tool, it's just the way you'd work through an Akamai process using different tools, but your once template configuration, that is the gold standard. So every time you're spinning up a new app, anytime you're spinning up a new geographic region, anytime you're spinning up a new environment, you're basing it off of that one single templated config. And so the really key thing that this enables you is that the amount of changes you're introducing every time a new app comes on board is minimal. You have a standard config, everything's already defined, and then as an app owner, when I try to spin something up, I'm only making changes that are a lot more relevant to me. So how do we do this in our user base, and what are some of the tools that are popular with our user base when it comes to this process? There are actually two ways we've seen our users do this. So when it comes to gold configs, again, the process of maintaining a templated config, and then everything that comes down is based on that templated config. There are two different ways you could do this. So the first one is you have one gold config. So you maintain a single config, and you have many apps within that config. So the way it works is you have that one configuration. 90% of that is controlled by an admin. Everything that's a little bit complicated, cache key settings, a bunch of these things. All of these are still controlled by the person in your organization who would typically work with Akamai. But 10% of the configs, so if you're an app owner who only simply cares about their TTL, or if you're an app owner who simply wants to enable a bunch of redirects, that is controllable by you. And again, all of that goes into the same config, but it's under one area. And we'll deep dive into that one on how that works as we go along. The second method that we see a lot of our users see is one gold config with many child configs. So in this case, you still have your gold config. Every time a new app is spun up, same process, but you're cloning your gold config. So every time a new app is spun up, it's based off the new config, of your templated gold config. And then every time there's an update that an admin needs to do, it's done across all of these configs at the same time. So let's see how that works with your Akamai tools. There are, as some of you go through this and as some of you look through this, none of this is groundbreaking. It's simply a way of working with Akamai, but in the past there have been certain challenges that have come your way when you're working with these processes. And really we've enabled tools and different CLIs, API commands to help you go around that. So let's dive into scenario 1, and then we'll dive into scenario 2 as well. But the first scenario is when you have that one goal config with many apps within. So again, this is something that's familiar to you. This is the property manager UI. You've always seen these different, the way you can differentiate between rules over here. Nothing new over here. The challenge that our users have always faced in the past is that now in this example, I'm assuming I'm a furniture store. I've got different apps for or different sections in here for my images, for my API, for my shoes, for my socks, for my sports. It could be anything. And in the past, the challenge has been, if I am the images team who's looking to make a bunch of changes, I really need to coordinate with the API team to figure out, can these changes be deployed? Because every time I activate this config, you're activating the whole config. So as the API team, I might be in the middle of making a bunch of different changes, and I'm hosed. Like literally, I did not want that change to go out. The images team is happy, yeah, they have activated. But then in my case, I've really run into this thing where I didn't want those changes to go out. So you're always talking to these different teams. You're coordinating with them. Often those coordinations with distributed teams can take days. So it's a really long, painful process. Just to recap that workflow. And so what we've really done over here is we've introduced a tool called the Akamai pipeline. If you look at the DevOps booth over there, we are demoing the tool. But essentially what the Akamai pipeline does is exposes this entire structure in a local Git repo. So as a user, you can now pull out your configuration, store it in a local repo. And that part is really powerful because all of these things that were tied to one particular thing and are now broken down into pieces. It's in a local repo. You can clone that repo. You can work on it independently of every other team and then deploy it. So you don't have to go coordinate with different teams on that one. So the way it would typically work is, just in the context of a goal config, is again, you have your site admin and you have an app owner. So in this case, consider I own this entire Akamai goal config. I'm the Akamai expert in the organization. And now I also have all of these different app owners who want to get onto Akamai, make their tweaks around apps that are specific to them. Again, the whole goal is keep 90% of the config the same. 10% of the config is very, very specific to what you guys are doing. So the first thing is you'd set up that goal config in a Git repo. So again, the Akamai pipeline tool that we have should allow you to pull down this configuration. You can have it in a repo. You can set it up so different rule snippets are addressable by different teams. And so that's the first step over here. The next step is you define your generic rules and variables. So again, let's say you're defining whether it's your origins, whether it's things that are common across all of your different teams. You define that across your config. And you could really use different sections or use different snippets to make that differentiation. The third thing you do over here is now you'd start including existing apps and app-specific rules in configs. So we've literally actually seen a lot of our users have a section right below that says app-specific rules. Below that, every time a new app is spun up, you just give them a blank config, and they can start working on it. And so anytime a new app is onboarded, you can now assign that app ownership in your local repository, and then they can go independently. So they'll clone that remote repo. They'll write app-specific rules, and then finally, once they are ready to deploy, they'd merge it, validate it, and push it. So this is, again, they are merging to that main config. They are validating the rules right locally. So is the syntax that I'm writing, is that the right syntax? Are the rules that I wrote, do they make sense? And then they push to a remote repo. Uh, and finally, just again, for the site admin themselves, they can continue to update their parts of the config with any generic rules, any generic information. So really, it creates this bifurcation of duties. So let's see how that looks like. And so this is a structure that we've enabled. So over here, that you would see this is your traditional Luna config. These are all of the rules you have set up. You may or may not set up different match conditions. You may or may not have segregated it. But now you could really use that one CLI command to pull this down. So what that CLI command does is it does a couple of different things. One is the GitHub repo that I sent. So again, everything you see over here is the same thing in my GitHub repo over here. But now, because it is in a remote repo, it opens up all of these different possibilities. It also has different abstractions around modularizing a bunch of your host names and variables across your config. And I'll talk about how this works in a little bit. But the key idea over here is you have a hostnames.json file. You have a hostnames.json file, which essentially, whereas you can define all of your hostname specific information. Again, this is typically controlled by your admin. They'd never expose it to their app owners. But this is a file that's controlled by them. You also have a variables.json file. Now, what this file does is essentially anything in a config can now be variabilized or tokenized locally. So in this example, I've just tokenized my origin host names, but CP codes, cloudlet policies, redirects, name anything, because now you have this thing locally. All it is doing is it's doing a string replace. So you have the ability to really variabilize anything in that config. And then obviously you have the individual snippets. The way these snippets come together is there's this main.json file in your config that accounts for every one of these different snippets. And then you also have a socks.json file wherein in our example, you have a match condition wherein you're saying, if my host name is this, or if my path match condition is this, enable set my TTL to something. So again, this is kind of the full thing, but again, the big takeaway over here is now you've got this in your remote repo as developers. You can now clone it, an admin could work on it somewhere else. Only when I'm ready to do something, I'll push it back in this remote repo and then have a CLI call for activate, wherein it activates it onto the Akamai network. Again, the big selling point over here is if I'm my API and an images team over here, my API team has cloned my remote repo to a local repo. My images team has cloned my remote repo to locally. The API team is done with their changes. They push to the remote repo and just activate. My images team is in the middle of their changes. They don't care. They are just working independently on their own because they are not working in this central repository directly. So that's really one method that we see with the gold config. Again, the DevOps demo over there is where you can see this in action. But the tool that we've been using for this, it's called the Akamai pipeline. It's part of a new property manager CLI package that we released. It's actually got two different modes. One is called the pipeline mode, wherein you can define the hostnames.json file that I showed. You can define different environments mapping to different origins. They can be differentiated on a bunch of different things. It could be CP codes, it could be policies, it could be anything. You just say what's specific to your environment. And then once you kind of go through this whole process wherein you make an Akamai configuration change, you validate it, you merge it to your remote repo, you activate it, you can promote that change through a pipeline of environments. It also has a second property manager snippets command, wherein if you don't care about this whole piece of it, you can just work on one property. You don't need to set it up in a CI/CD pipeline. You can just break down a property locally and work on it if that's the only thing you care about. But again, the whole coming back to the gold config part of it, the whole value proposition behind this is now I don't have to I can have that distribution between my different teams, but again, maintain some kind of consistency across my different apps. And we're going to spend a few minutes for questions at the end, so we'll open it up for any questions you guys have then too. The second one is one goal config with many child configs. So in this case now, you don't have a single config, but you have a bunch of different configs every time a new app is spun up. You're trying to just maintain a new config for that. And that's a scenario that we see across a lot of our users. Two, in this example, I've got the www.myonlineshop.com, which is my primary site, and then I've got images, API, socks, shoes, everything you saw as snippets previously in one config. These are just different configs by themselves. So what would the workflow look like in this case? So same thing. I start off by setting up my goal config. Everything looks good. I define my generic rules, so anything that applies to all of the different teams in my organization, that's defined. But at this point of time, I actually completely let app owners clone that config. So my app owners can really clone that goal config and set up their own little config. The sidebar over here, we have a new secure provisioning workflow that we released a couple of months back. That's really helpful when it comes to this. And we'll share the slides for this so you guys have the link. But if you go to learn.akamai.com, getting started, you should see onboard a new property wherein you can go from that A to Z process of provisioning or onboarding a new host name or onboarding a new config securely completely. The second thing is now you define those app-specific rules and changes. So again, as an app owner, I'm maintaining my different configs. I'm defining my apps and changes. I'm maintaining that independent property. I don't have to depend on the primary property. And my site admin continues to do what they have. But this is where goal config comes in, wherein we have a new tool called a bulk updates API, wherein you can now use a couple of API calls to make the same change across multiple configs. So again, if you go to developer.akamai.com, this is under the PAPI documentation. You'll see a section called bulk config updates. The big endpoints over there that we've enabled are you can search for certain criteria across all of your configs. So search for anything wherein the CP code matches this, or the host name matches this, or certain custom behavior is enabled. And then you can update that config with something else too. So across all of these different configs, change this redirect rule from this particular URL to this, or change this host name from www.example.com to xyzexample.com. But that's something that's really cool that you could use when you go through this whole scenario. Again, we'll share this presentation so you guys have the links to it. So really, when it comes to goal configs, there's nothing game-changing or out of the box that's required when you're looking to move your organization to that. It's just being a little bit more selective around what tools you want to use and then what method you want to see over there. There are pros and cons to both approaches. There are just pros to both approaches in case you guys want to go that direction. But it really comes down to your organizational needs around which of these different methods you guys want to use. So to recap all of this, goal configuration, but essentially that's a single template config that you leverage to spin up new apps. You can have different configs that you maintain, or you can spin up new snippets within the same templated config. Big benefits is consistency. That's the big one that comes up for everyone, faster release cycles, segregation of duties, and then that integration into your CI/CD pipelines. And these are all the resources that I talked about that you could use when it comes to those. So if you're looking to use the first method, the property manager CLI, the snippets and the pipeline module, those are really relevant over here. You can use this. They are on our GitHub repo. They are on our learn.akamai.com site. They are on our developer.akamai.com site. So if you just do a search for Akamai pipeline or the property manager CLI, you should be able to find it. For method 2, we used a couple of different tools. The first one was the new secure onboarding API workflow that we released. This one's on learn.akamai.com. Go to the getting started section over here. You'll see a card for spin up a new secure property. And then the second tool that we have is the bulk search and update endpoints. It's on the developer.akamai.com, our API documentation. Go under property manager and you'll see a section for bulk search and update. Cool. Thank you. Any questions or anything to deep dive on that one? Yep, links back on. Sorry, I'll move out of the way so you guys can take pictures.
Akamai Sandbox work more in detail.
Yes, so the question is, how does Akamai Sandbox work in the context of this? And so where the Akamai Sandbox would really come into the picture is over here. So in this process, what would happen is when I am that app owner, whether I'm in any of those processes I choose, when I'm that app owner, I'm typically working in a local repo. It's either a virtual machine or some kind of a containerized environment. The challenge is I want to test my changes really early. And so I cannot do this. Typically, back in the day, I could not do this. I had to wait to send it to Akamai staging or production. What the sandbox does is it opens a connection, secure connection from that virtual machine to the Akamai network. And so right off the boat, you can start testing those changes right away. So even before you commit it to your build server, this is the point at which you'd use the sandbox to unit test any change. We also have an Akamai Sandbox demo. So behind the DevOps booth, there's the Akamai Sandbox demo where you can see this in action. But this is, again, the Akamai Sandbox would really come into the picture when you're unit testing any of these changes locally.
So if a property has many host names, so it is recommended to use the path 1 or a single a property includes single host name, you recommend the path 2.
So if a property has many host names, yes, path 1 is the best, probably your best bet over there, because I'm guessing if a property has many host names, what you're looking to do is all of these properties share the same config. You're trying to really get to that standardized step, but not spin up new configs, which really is path 1, yes.
It's probably not related, but if we have properties in different environments, right? So development environment, then a QA, and we create golden standards and we define what to be configurations to be done. So development is the step 1 for those configurations. So you will discuss those configuration with development in development environment and have those set up. How do I, or is there any way, or maybe rather I should say, what's your recommendation how we propagate all those changes throughout all the environments? So my challenge has been none of the environment are in sync, and every time I have to make that synchronization, I have to manually move stuff around in all the environments.
Yeah, so the question is around how do you propagate all of your property changes between different environments without replicating all of your environments. So that's really, again, where this approach comes into the picture, wherein what the Akamai Property Manager CLI is doing is essentially it's just exposing a template config. So actually, I might make this a little bit more real and see if I can share a config that I have. And so this is a config that I pulled down that I'm working on. What it is doing is it's just, and as I wait for the internet to load, what it is doing is it's just creating this template where it's basing all of your different rules. When I go back to the repository and I click on environments, I'm also defining my environments, wherein you see my dev environment has the host names that it cares about, and it's also mapped to the origin that it wants to get mapped to. So over here, you'll see in the variables.json file, the thing that's really specific to my dev environment is the origin host name. So even at the back of it, you're not really replicating the changes between different environments. All the pipeline does is it just has a command that says promote to dev, promote to QA, promote to production. So you don't have to do it on your own every single time. It already has all of the information around what are the different properties, what are the different host names everything is mapped to, and the change is just flowing through that workflow. So the takeaway there is you aren't the one manually doing all of those changes in your config, all of that, all of those different backend properties, backend host names are just managed by Akamai, and you just have to have that one click, promote to dev, promote to QA. Any other questions?